Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the second day of our conference, The Reluctant Superpower. My name is Ian Harper and it's my privilege to chair this morning's session. Our first session this morning focuses on India's neighbourhood. We have three experts this morning to present to us on different aspects of that topic. Each in his own right is an expert in areas of defence, international relations, security, issues of that type, and we'll be treated to three perspectives on these matters as they concern India and South Asia more generally. What I'd like to do is to introduce each of our speakers to you at the outset, and then I'll invite each of them to come and make their remarks to you. We're dealing with an hour, so we've asked each speaker to speak for around about 15 minutes or perhaps a little more, and then we'll leave opportunity at the end of the session for questions from the floor. So please do think about what you might like to ask one or more of our speakers as they give their presentations. Well, beginning here on the left of the stage, on your right, is Professor Suranjan Das. Professor Das is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Calcutta, and it's Professor Das's first time in Australia, and we're very pleased to have you, Professor Das, come all the way from Calcutta to be with us here. Professor Das is an historian, and he has a range of credits to his name, in particular a number of very serious and meritorious prizes. He's also written books on the issues of communal rights, food movement and electoral politics in South Asia. Professor Das will speak to us today about India's Pakistan conundrum, past, present and future. Our second speaker in the middle of the three is Dr. Rajesh Rajagopalan. Rajesh is currently visiting ICCR chair at Victoria University in Wellington, so he's come across the ditch to be with us. He tells me that Wellington at this time of the year is very different from Delhi at this time of the year, and he's quite relieved to be away from the dust and the heat, no doubt. Not much dust and heat in Wellington, one has to say. Whatever there is blows away very quickly. His substantive position is Professor, Centre for International Politics, Organisation and Disarmament in the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Rajesh is a defence expert. His interests are international relations theory, military doctrines, counterinsurgency, nuclear weapons and disarmament. But today he's going to speak to us about India and the future of South Asia. So Rajesh is not necessarily focusing on the India-Pakistan issue, but more generally for the neighbourhood of India. And then our third speaker, on your left and my right here on the panel, is Dr. Ashutosh Misra. Ashutosh is presently a research fellow at the ARC Centre for Excellence in Policing and Security at Griffith University. And Ashutosh is an expert in the areas associated with defence studies and analysis. Today he's going to speak to us about achieving peace amidst hostilities, lessons from Indo-Pak dyadic conflict. I'm an economist for my sins, and I had to ask them what dyadic meant, so I've learnt a new word today. Diadem I know, dyadic I don't, but now I do. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the rostrum our three speakers, but to begin with, Professor Das.
Well, could I first say a very big thank you to my friend from Oxford Days, Professor Amitabh Mattu, and his extremely dedicated colleagues for enabling me to be here, which is proving to be extremely fruitful and productive seminar. Let me start with a question. What is India's Pakistan riddle? The received wisdom on Indo-Pak relations reflects two interrelated paradigms. A state of permanent hostility, and B, something like a divorce-bound marriage where cooperation and confrontation always hang around. Such perceptions, I submit, however, essentially reflect the realist discourse in international relations. But we need to go beyond what yesterday Munishankar Iyer reminded us, the statist approach to appreciate what I call the aspirations among the growing segments of civil societies on both sides of the border for a mutually beneficial, cooperative economic bilateralism that should contribute to the overturning of traditional state behavior and preferences and reduce possibilities of hostilities. This submission of mine proposes to identify possibilities for Indo-Pak constructive economic bilateralism, which I argue, if realized, should create conditions not only for Indo-Pak bilateral stability, but also South Asian regional stability. This brings me to the first section of my presentation, which I entitle Imperatives for Indo-Pak Economic Bilateralism. The subcontinent is a set of multiple contradictions. It represents 3% of the world's area, but houses 21% of the global population. The region remains one of the worst examples of developmental dichotomies. Despite the pessimism of many Western scholars, India has withstood successfully the challenges to a democratic and federal polity. She is the world's second fastest growing economy. Her standing in international community has been also considerably enhanced in recent years. But the shining India unfortunately coexists with a large dark India, to which again Munishankar Iyer referred to as saying India is prospering, but Indians are not. The record of human development in Pakistan is perhaps more worrisome. Its position in UNDP Human Development Index has slipped to 144th slot. The highest 20% Pakistanis share 41% of the household income, and the lowest 40% share 22% of the household's income. The fruits of development thus tend to be monopolized by a microscopic minority in both South Asian states, although India and Pakistan respectively currently spend for defense approximately 13.29% and 18% of the national budgets. However, the two countries can adopt measures for ensuring balanced economic growth only through a curtailment of the defense expenditure, which again can be made possible by economic bilateralism. The distinguished Pakistani political economist Mahbul Haq had estimated long time back that a mere 5% reduction in the annual military budgets of the two countries over a period of 10 years could go a long way in fulfilling basic social needs of the people in the region. Changing dynamics of international political economy of the post-Cold War period and growing international disengagement in Afghanistan have also imposed on India and Pakistan new compulsions for economic and technological collaboration. I skip over the details because of the paucity of time. The details that I'll be setting out in my paper. The second aspect of my presentation is entitled Lessons from the Past Towards Indo-Pak Trade Bilateralism. Till the British could divide and quit the subcontinent on 15th August 1947, India and Pakistan were parts of the same economic unit. Unfortunately for Pakistan, she did not inherit those areas of British India which were industrial conclaves. To minimize the adverse economic implications of the partition, Pakistan concluded with India a standstill agreement in August 1947. But the agreement was violated more than it was observed. The end of 1949 witnessed a rapid downturn in Indo-Pak trade relations. The Pakistan economy henceforth remained insulated from India by high tariffs and quantitative restrictions. The severance of bilateral commercial relations in the post-1949 period forced both Pakistan and India to adopt economic adjustment programs that impeded their self-sufficiency. Pakistan's plan of industrialization became dependent upon Western technology and capital. She even imported coal, steel, and iron ore from the West, China, South Korea, Brazil, and Australia, when she could have purchased them from India at half the price. Even for an agricultural item like wheat, Islamabad turned to Australia, perhaps for Australian benefit, but although she could have imported it from India and saved her hard currency. Pakistan started importing tea from Kenya at a higher price when she could have purchased that same tea from India at lower rates. Pakistan was compelled to accept another dose of adjustment in its foreign trade in 1971 with the emergence of Bangladesh. At the same time, India incurred considerable opportunity cost in rearranging her economy. For instance, areas more suitable for paddy cultivation were converted to jute cropping to counteract the crisis caused by Pakistan's decision to prohibit export of raw jute. India imported pig iron and iron scrap from outside the region, although she could have purchased them from Pakistan for a much lower transportation cost. I argue subtle signs of change in Indo-Pak economic bilateralism could be discerned following the 1972 Shimla Treaty. In November-December 1981, Pakistan joined for the first time the Delhi International Trade Fair. In 1986, India and Pakistan signed the SAARC agreement. By July 1989, Pakistan agreed to import 322 Indian items. In 1996, Pakistan participated for the first time the SAARC Industrial Exhibition in Delhi, which occasioned the Punjab, Haryana, Delhi Chambers of Commerce and Federation of Pakistan Chambers of Commerce and Industries to prepare a potential inventory for normal bilateral trading relations between India and Pakistan. We then had the Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The US-based Center for Trade Development estimated that this recent study that a South Asian Economic Union could generate a 5-fold increase of intra-SAARC trade that could particularly benefit India and Pakistan. The late Indian diplomat J.N. Dixit testifies in his memoirs the refusal of leading businessmen in Lahore, Karachi, Peshawar, and Quetta to accept the traditional contention of Islamabad that the Pakistani public would not accept normalization of economic relations with India without a resolution of politico-military dichotomies. By the end of 1990, the National Shipping Corporation of Pakistan itself urged Islamabad to scrap the 1947 restrictive protocol which restricted bilateral shipping. By this time, both New Delhi and Islamabad also acknowledged how a thriving informal underground smuggling trade across the border denied them substantial revenue. Although the official annual bilateral trade remains little more than $2 billion, Pakistan accounting for less than 0.5% of India's trade, and India accounting for little more 1% of Pakistan's trade, there exists an undercover border trade estimated to be $351.5 million a year, and an informal trade between $2 billion and $3 billion per year via third countries. This unofficial and informal trade can surely occur at a significantly lower cost and be mutually beneficial for both states. A recent study of Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that the potentials of Indo-Pak open and formal trade could be roughly 20 times greater than the current recorded trade. It has been argued that trade liberalization in the agricultural sector alone could create 0.27 million jobs in India and 0.17 million jobs in Pakistan. The fact that economic bilateralism is feasible, irrespective of political differences, was demonstrated in the autumn of 1990 when India helped Pakistan to tide over a sudden potato and onion crisis. During the natural disasters, India and Pakistan have been trying to help each other, as was evident during the 2001 earthquake in India, the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan, and 2010 flood in Pakistan. India, however, has to allay Pakistan's fear that the opening of our economy would not lead to Indian hegemony over Pakistan's domestic market. Perhaps one way of gaining Pakistani confidence is perhaps to adopt a phased manner approach in the elimination of trade barriers. Tradable commodities between the two countries can be categorized into non-competing, competing, and exempted products, and different time frames may be adopted for the extension of preferential tariff treatment to them. Another study suggests introduction of open trade in phases to make both countries realize the benefits of such a system. The first phase is proposed to be concerned with the adoption of short-term measures relating to trade facilitation. The second phase may coincide with what has been called improvement and harmonization of infrastructure at both ends, and I skip over the details. The third section of my presentation is entitled Towards an Indo-Pak Cooperative Technological Bilateralism. So from trade bilateralism, I move on to technological bilateralism. Contributing 78% to South Asia's total manufacturing value, India has an unmistakable regional technological superiority in both capital and intermediate technology in the region. A technical partnership between Islamabad and New Delhi should be particularly beneficial to Pakistan, since about 60% of the country's development budget relies on foreign credit to import capital and intermediate goods. During the 1980s, in the Hazara region of Pakistan, large deposits of rock phosphate were discovered, which could have been processed economically with Indian technology. Similarly, studies have shown Indian enterprises can help the establishment of coal washeries to free the high ash content of Pakistani coal. In paper production too, India and Pakistan, it has been argued, may collaborate to promote environment-friendly bagasse-based technique. India's CSIR and ICAR, the two scientific and agricultural bodies, it has been argued, can fruitfully collaborate with the Pakistani counterparts in the realms of food and fermentation technology. The space programs of India and Pakistan can be coordinated. Joint space program has already produced rich dividends for Washington and Moscow. A direct high satellite data link is to be established between India and China. Such cooperative ventures between India and Pakistan should be forthcoming too. Besides, there exist possibilities of Indo-Pak joint enterprises. A number of policy papers prepared by the industrial houses in both countries have clearly identified areas for such Indo-Pak technological collaboration, and I skip over the details. To enhance Indo-Pak economic bilateralism, scholars have also advocated such time-tested measures as qualifying industrial zones and cross-border infrastructure projects like the East-West Economic Corridor linking Greater Mekong sub-region in Southeast Asia to the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. One recent study has predicted a 50% reduction in the possibilities of militarized interstate disputes in the region if concerned parties can be brought within a regional trading structure. Another domain for Indo-Pak technological collaboration is productive utilization of a common reach geosystem. Yesterday, Mr. Sam Sharon was explicating the energy security in India. A possible means of improving electricity supply in India and Pakistan lies in joint utilization of the region's hydropower resources and transmission of the generated electricity through an interconnecting Indo-Pak power grid system. Electricity imported by Pakistan from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan could be also connected to the Pakistan grid in northwest frontier provinces for supply to the subcontinent. A common electricity grid system is operating in North America, Europe, Africa, and West Asia, and the method should logically work in South Asia. Besides, India can transfer its solar technology to Pakistan in provinces like Sindh. Bilateral collaboration has been proposed for the use of renewable sources of energy. Joint surveillance of environmental changes can also provide advance warnings to natural disasters. I also endorse Mr. Ayer's support for the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline to ease the energy crisis in the region. This brings me to the conclusion of my presentation, which I have entitled The Way Forward. The discussion has hopefully uncovered potentials of Indo-Pak economic and technological bilateralism, where I argue mutually beneficial commonalities, complementarities, and substitutabilities exist. Growing consciousness for peace and cooperation between the two countries at the popular level was recently candidly expressed when a young Pakistani told UNDP officials, and I quote, "Who wants submarines and guns? We want schools and hospitals," unquote. Expanding trade relations should generate such political sensitivities for broader bilateralism. A recent opinion poll conducted by the Indian Express, Dawn News, and CNN IBN testifies to the overwhelming popular aspiration on both sides of the border for normal economic and cooperative relationship. Interestingly, during recent official meetings, both New Delhi and Islamabad are moving towards comprehensive dialogues and removal of trust deficit. The recent cricket diplomacy and the latest meeting between the Pakistan and Indian foreign ministers are indications of this trend. I argue that the Gujarat Doctrine, premised on India taking steps to create cooperative neighborhood without insisting on reciprocity, appears to be gaining in relevance. Surely there are factors like fundamentalism on both sides, the Kargil wall, the continuing Pakistani involvement in Jammu and Kashmir, the suspected Pak hand in terrorist attacks in India, impinge on the framework of Indo-Pak economic bilateralism. But we also have evidence of sections of Indian and Pakistani civil societies disapproving of military engagements between the two countries. I cite a perceptive Pakistani analyst, Azazuddin's remark following Bajpayee's Lahore trip in February 1999. I quote, "The Indians came to Lahore with an olive branch. We responded with Kargil. Never in 50 years of independence have we seemed less like a state and more like a stringless Pinocchio capering to a dance choreographed at Blair House," unquote. During the height of Kargil crisis, public rallies were held in Pakistan demanding an end to nuclearization of South Asia and normalization of relations between the two countries. The Peshawar-based Urdu poet Ahmad Faraz recently recounts in his poem, Hindustani Dosto Ke Naam, and I cite the English version, I quote, "Umpteen years have rolled by, but you and we are still sad," unquote. Equally revealing of the spirit was that of a Delhi student of class 10 who wrote after a recent Indo-Pak Exchange Summit, and I quote, "Let's take the blinders from our eyes and take the padding off our ears. Let's confess we have heard each other crying and together wipe each other's tears," unquote. Sikh activists are proposing a corridor to enable religious pilgrimages without visas. Researchers in Pakistan are also increasingly writing of what they call the need for, I quote, "conflict transformation," unquote. In fact, I argue, neither New Delhi nor Islamabad would be able in the long run to deny the reality that the people of India and Pakistan, despite the flawed inheritance, do reason together. I'll just take 2 minutes. History demonstrates disputes or even armed conflicts do not necessarily impede trading relations, which in the long run yield peace dividend between warring neighboring states. France and Germany have buried their traditional rivalry to become European Union's leading partners. Border disputes between Malaysia and Thailand have not deterred them from operating within the ASEAN free trade regime. Thailand and Vietnam were on opposing sides during the Vietnam War. Vietnam and Cambodia fought each other in 1975. Sino-Vietnam clashes occurred in 1979. Thailand and Laos were involved in border clashes in 1988. Yet, all of them today have developed strong economic ties under the auspices of the ASEAN. Argentina and Brazil have arrived at a nuclear rapprochement, bypassing the traditional mistrust. South Asia also today, I argue, offers a relatively favorable scenario to take Indo-Pak economic bilateralism to new heights. Islamabad's present government is perhaps poised to become Pakistan's longest-serving civilian government, and democratic regimes do contribute to improved bilateralism. External presence in the region, especially in the context of the projected withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan, should provide greater leverage to the two countries in pursuing their priorities in mutual interest. Despite apprehensions of its American tilt, New Delhi has recently demonstrated its political independence by opting for a contract of $11 billion for 2 European combat aircrafts by refusing American bids. Nevertheless, friends, the path towards Indo-Pak cooperative bilateralism might be strenuous and long, but as has been aptly remarked, I quote, "There are lots of things that you do now which would have been seemed insane to you 10 years ago. Those things themselves did not change, but your idea of yourself changed. What was impossible before is perfectly possible now, and perhaps your total success in changing yourself is only a matter of time," unquote. The leadership in two countries has to take cognizance of a growing reservoir of symbiotic trust at the popular level and use it imaginatively to promote horizontal bilateral economic linkages. Equally pertinent is the perceptive comment from a Pakistani analyst, I quote, India and Pakistan have previously needed each other as adversaries. Now they need each other to realize their ambitions. Pakistan can't hope to be a dynamic and stable force without resolving its problems at home with India. India can't sustain a high rate of growth in the long run without a more cooperative relationship with its neighbors, unquote. May I end this submission with a quote from Alexander Pope, who reminded us long time back, and I quote, what war could ravish, commerce could bestow, and he returned a friend who came a foe, unquote. India and Pakistan, I conclude, need to move ahead with this spirit. One is reminded of the famous couplet of Ali Sabdat Jafri, which the English translation of which runs as follows, I quote, you come from the garden of Lahore, O carrier of flowers. We come with the first sun rays of Benares. Then let's explore who the enemy is, unquote. Time has come to understand and identify who the enemy is that is impinging on what should have been normal economic Indo-Pak bilateralism. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Das. Let's move straight to Dr. Rajesh Ragopalan to talk about India and the future of South Asia. Please welcome Dr. Ragopalan.
Thank you. Let me also begin by thanking the Australia-India Institute and Professor Mattu and his staff in particular for inviting me to this one of the largest India conferences, I think, in the world. Hopefully it will sort of become an annual event looking at India. My brief today is to talk about India and the challenges facing South Asia. What I'm planning to do is
Just press the right-hand arrow.
I think it's the wrong. Okay, I got it. Okay.
Got it?
Yeah, got it. Broadly, what I'm planning to do is focus on the challenges that's facing South Asia as a region, as well as the future of India's policy for the region. I outlined 6 major variables that could potentially affect the region. One is the regional imbalance in South Asia. The second is the impact of global politics, economic integration, democratization in the region, and identity issues, and of course, finally, Afghanistan as a key variable. Let me start with looking at South Asia as a region itself. There are, why is South Asia not very much of a region in a political sense? I mean, if you look at much of the rest of the world, there is, in addition to the example of the European Union, but we also have ASEAN, the ASEAN zone, as it were. But South Asia somehow, the entire SAARC experience seemed more a copycat exercise of these other regions rather than really a heartfelt sort of attempt to create regionalization. Professor Das talked about some of those aspects. So what I'm sort of looking at is what are some of the reasons that drive us closer, as well as some of the reasons that haven't sort of made us into much of a region. Geography clearly is an important aspect of the region. South Asia is a very clearly defined region in the sense that there is a sort of a, some of the works on regionalization begin with South Asia, look at South Asia because of the integrated nature of the region. So clearly that is South Asia geographically makes a good region. It also, if you look at both the Indian and Pakistani efforts, Pakistani efforts to look west, for example, away from South Asia, looking towards West Asia, and the failure of that effort, as well as for different reasons, India's approach to look east, again, the failure of that effort to some extent. Both illustrate the integrative nature of South Asia, because both of them suggest that without sort of looking at the region, you can't really, without sort of understanding the region, you can't really go out of the region. And so both the Pakistani effort to look west, as well as to some extent the Indian effort to look east, failed partly because of the fact that South Asia itself is such a clear region. And of course, there is history and culture, and as well as ethnic links that all integrate the region. But on the other hand, what's driving South Asia apart to some extent are also the same factors, in the sense that geography is an important aspect of what South Asia, or the reason why South Asia has so much difficulties as a region. And the simple explanation here is, of course, that the region, the geography of the region makes all of South Asia, every South Asian state, a neighbor of India and not a neighbor to each other. And that's one of the key problems that South Asia faces. Obviously, the only other case is of Afghanistan and Pakistan, who are neighbors to each other, and we know how good their relationship is. So in a sense, the fact that there is no, the South Asian states are not particularly neighbors to each other, but just neighbors to India, is a peculiar geographical factor that that tends to divide the region. Similarly, history and culture, I'll talk about that a little bit later. All of these are factors primarily because of the dominance of India in the region that tends to create problems rather than tends to unite the region. If we go to some of these variables that I talked about earlier, that I sort of listed out earlier, one of the most important problems that South Asia faces, one of the most important difficulties that South Asia faces is a huge regional imbalance within the region itself. The regional disparities in South Asia are far greater than the disparities in any other region. Since we are here in the South Pacific, I mean, the only other region that is potentially has greater disparities in the South Pacific zone, because Australia, New Zealand, and the microstates here. But outside of that, of the major regions, of the major political regions in the world, there is no region that has the level of disparity that South Asia has. Indian dominance of the region in terms of size, population, wealth, and so on is unmatched. And this naturally leads to a certain level of insecurity for most of India's neighbors. That insecurity you can see in Pakistani efforts for the last, ever since India and Pakistan became independent, the various efforts in Pakistan to balance India, both in terms of developing its internal military capacity, spending enormous quantities on its military. Pakistan has routinely spent, we go back to the 1950s, and every decade since then, Pakistan has spent roughly twice as much proportionately as India has on its national security, but it has still not managed to come up to anywhere near the Indian defense spending in absolute senses, for the simple reason, obviously, that India's wealth is so much greater, India's GDP is so much greater. So in a sense, you see a constant Pakistani effort to balance India by building up its defense capabilities, but not really managing to do that. It also, part of that, in addition to building up its internal military capacity, another part of that balancing effort is in terms of seeking alliances. And from the beginning, Pakistan has been seeking alliances primarily to deal with their India problem, as it were. This goes back to obviously during the Cold War period, the United States, China, and so on, and even including currently their whole support for the Taliban is primarily designed as an effort to deal with their Indian security problem. So in a sense, what you have is a single-minded, constant effort on the part of Pakistan to balance India, which is a consequence of that imbalance in South Asia. But it is not just Pakistan. I mean, that is the key thing to understand. All of India's other neighbors have that same insecurity vis-a-vis India. It is just that, with the exception of Pakistan, none of them have the domestic capacity to balance India. So to some extent, given that they have no domestic capacity to balance India, they have to look for alliances. They have to look for external means to balance India. And so all of them, all of India's neighbors, have at various points of time attempted to create balances by seeking alliances with extra-regional powers, so much to the insecurity, much to the sort of the concern of India. Nepal obviously does that with China. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have done that with the United States as well as with China. So in a sense, all of India's neighbors, this huge disparity in the region affects all of India's neighbors and creates further insecurities in that region. And if you look at the trends in the region, that is actually also going further. That imbalance is actually growing, because if you look at over the last 20 years of India's growth, that Indian growth, along with, not that India's neighbors haven't grown, but India's growth is so much greater that the disparity in the region is actually getting worse. And therefore, the shift in power and wealth towards India could potentially lead to even greater insecurity within the region. The question now is that, considering that the historical experience has been of most of India's neighbors to seek external allies, would this increasing insecurity in the future over the next 2 or 3 decades, as India and China begin to compete in each other's backyards, would China now become the new balancer within the region? And I would agree with Dr. Das. One of the ways in which India could potentially stem that rising tide of insecurity in the region as a consequence of this growing imbalance would be a sort of a new Gujarat doctrine, or a sort of a refurbishment of the existing Gujarat doctrine. Another obviously important variable is the pressure of global politics. Obviously, global politics have always impacted on the region. The US and the Cold War period, US and the Soviet Union have sought allies in the region, and even though they have sought allies in the region, India and Pakistan have been very good at actually using the external powers to balance their own regional adversaries. So, so Pakistan has used obviously external allies to balance India very well, and despite all talk of Indian idealism, India obviously has used external allies, both the United States and the Soviet Union, at different points of time to balance China. So in a sense, the impact of global politics has also an impact on the region as a whole. And in the post-Cold War period, during the unipolar, over the last 20 years, again, both India and Pakistan have used the United States to get their ends. Of course, India has used it better, much to Pakistan's concern, for example, in the nuclear deal. So in a sense, the impact of regional politics has been heavy on the region, on the impact of global politics has been heavy on the region, and therefore, what would the consequences be of the emerging multipolarity? There is a general sense, if you look at much of India's foreign policy statements and joint declarations and so on and so forth, multipolarity is generally welcomed. And definitely it sounds more democratic to say that more countries should have, or the power should be more equally distributed in the global system than concentrated in the hands of 1 or 2 powers. And definitely that is true. In a democratic sense, that is true. But there are also negative consequences to multipolarity, which we don't always consider. One of the consequences is that one of the consequences of a potential US decline would be great power conflict and great power sort of politics, especially in the Asian region between India and China. That greater competitiveness that will accompany multipolarity could potentially see, again, a regional impact, because, as I said, Chinese impact on India's region, as well as India's impact on China's backyard. I mean, in a sense, what we're seeing is both India and China playing games in each other's backyard. I mean, India doing that in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and obviously China to some extent doing that in India's neighborhood. Thank you. This could also have an impact on the region, obviously, because it could have regionalization could suffer as a consequence of this kind of politics if both sides, both India and China, were to engage in these kinds of politics in each other's backyard. The next variable that I would look at is economic integration. Both yesterday and today, we've had a number of presentations on economic integration in the region. Intra-regional trade has declined, as we heard, from somewhere around 20% of the total trade during the colonial period to something like 4% by the 1960s. So there was a huge drop in terms of intra-regional trade since the colonial period, and that has improved marginally for the last 2 decades. But what I would suggest is that the political impact of this of trade is unclear. I mean, there's a general argument which Professor Das expressed very eloquently that trade might lead to greater peace and greater integration. Obviously, China-India trade has been increasing. China-Japan trade has been increasing. Sino-US trade has been increasing, but so has conflict between these countries. So, in a sense, the natural correlation between trade and peace, I'm somewhat skeptical about. But nevertheless, the point is that trade in the region has not really gone up very much. So even though the consequence of that, I'm not really sure was necessarily positive. Democratization, again, similarly, the democratic effects in terms of peace or economic development tend to be somewhat unclear. But nevertheless, if you look at the region, what you do find is that probably for the first time, all the states in the region are formally democracies. But formal democracy and liberal democracy are not the same thing. So if you look at Freedom House reports, essentially only India is classified as a democracy as free. Now, whatever the freedom, we may disagree with Freedom House's way of measuring these things, but nevertheless, the future of democracy in the region is also somewhat uncertain, and therefore the regional consequences, again, unlike as in the case of trade, I'm uncertain about the regional consequences of this of democratization. Let me sort of quickly wind up by looking at the future of Afghanistan and what the consequence of that would be for India's of the region. Number of different issues here. Obviously, a precipitous U.S. withdrawal remains unclear whether that would happen or not. But if there is a U.S. withdrawal over the next few years, the consequences for the region again could be potentially quite dangerous. Some arguments suggest that the Taliban will be much more pragmatic if they come back to power, that they will not do what they did in the 1990s. But if the Taliban does return to power, obviously, I suspect that they will go back to essentially becoming a base for a variety of undesirable elements. It will, more importantly, I think it will also strengthen the ISI, both in terms of the ISI's terrorist outreach program, in terms of aiding various terrorist groups, but also in terms of internal Pakistani politics in allowing ISI to win that domestic argument about whether what they were doing in Afghanistan was necessarily the right thing to do. So the consequences for much of the region would be potentially dangerous if the Taliban were to return. The future of Indian policy in the region and of the region itself, India's regional policy has by and large been bilateralism for obvious reasons. But the region's policy, much of India's neighborhoods policy, has also been bilateralism for the simple reason, again, that they had more to sort of more of a problem with India. Therefore, much of the issues that they had was more related to India than with other regional states. So, in a sense, for both India and the region, bilateralism has been the preferred approach rather than a regional approach, and that a regional consolidation, therefore, remains somewhat unlikely in the near term. Bilateralism will continue to remain, I suspect, the key to regional stability over the near term. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajgopalan. Let's move straight to Dr. Misra and achieving peace. amidst hostilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. High Commissioner Mrs. Sujata Singh, Professor Amitabh Mattu, ladies and gentlemen. For many of you who are not very familiar with the geography of India, I was born in Allahabad. And Allahabad is known for a place which is known as Triveni, or the tri-junction of three rivers. There are three rivers, Ganges, Jamna, and the Saraswati. You can see the Ganges, you can see the Jamna, you cannot see the Saraswati. It is considered it's there. In the program, you don't see my name, but I'm there. On a serious note, I want to congratulate Professor Amitabh Mattu and his entire team of Australia-India Institute in putting up such a fantastic workshop. And it was needed. And it has announced the arrival of Australia-India Institute in Australia with a big bang. So congratulations on that. I have chosen to speak on this subject because I thought it was not only interesting but also challenging. If you look at Indo-Pak dyadic rivalry, it's one of the most intensely debated and discussed relationship in the international system. There are countless studies which focus on the conflict part of India-Pakistan relations and would argue why it is not possible to make peace, why it is not possible to resolve disputes. I think that's very easy to say. But what is hard to say is to conclude and argue why it is possible to make peace. And that's what I am endeavoring to do today. My objective today is to extract lessons from India-Pakistan past negotiations in 5 disputes and show that even despite being locked into a pattern of enduring conflict, India and Pakistan can still sit together, talk, negotiate, and settle disputes. And if you can show that, then a totally different picture of India-Pakistan emerges, which is not as hostile as it is generally understood. I will focus on 5 disputes, as I said. First is the Indus-Waters Treaty of 1960, Ran of Kutch dispute, which was settled in 1965 and 1968, Siachen, Sir Creek, Tulbul, which are pending, but I call them near successes. 1960 Indus-Waters Treaty was signed over 6 rivers after partition. And India-Pakistan had to decide who had the right to use rivers in a consumptive manner. The Ran of Kutch was in the western sector of India. It involved 9,000 square miles of area, of which 3,000 lay disputed, 3,000 square miles, of which finally Pakistan was given 300 square miles in 1968. The Siachen dispute is considered the highest battleground in the world. It's also regarded as the 3rd pole, and it's still pending for settlement. And the 4th one, the Sir Creek, is again in the western sector of India, which is the unfinished dispute from the 1965-68 of Ran of Kutch settlement, and it's a 60-mile long estuary. And the land boundary is also related to the maritime boundary, which needs to be settled. And finally, the 5th one is the Tulbul-Wular dispute in Jammu and Kashmir. The nomenclature itself indicates the differences that India and Pakistan have over the dispute. It's called the Tulbul Navigation Project by India. Pakistan calls it the Wular Barrage Storage Project. And when I'll be talking about these disputes, I'll be referring to various stages of negotiations. From the literature of negotiations, I have drawn 4 broad stages, although you cannot define when a stage ends and when the next stage starts, but broadly you can define and categorize stages in negotiations into 4 parts. The first is the ripeness of the dispute. Second is pre-negotiations. Third is negotiations, and fourth is the agreement if you reach there. To me, the first two stages are extremely important. That is the ripeness of the dispute and the pre-negotiation stage. Ripeness, many people talk about ripeness of a dispute without explaining it what ripeness is all about. Ripeness is when there's a shared perception on both sides for the desirability of an accord. When both sides say, we want agreement. Second, ripeness comes in the dispute when there's a strong leadership on both sides, which is willing to take the risk, which is willing to take strong decisions. Third, when both sides conclude that unilateral solution is not possible. We have to come to a mutually beneficial agreement. That's when you say this dispute has become ripe for negotiations. And there's also another factor. You'll see a lot of disputes which are ripe for negotiations in India and Pakistan's rivalry. For instance, Siachen. You see it is ripe for negotiation, but you do not see as ripe for settlement. That's the difference. And the second is the pre-negotiation stage. In the pre-negotiation stage, as the literature suggests, what the parties do is they try to define the problem, which is extremely important. If both sides can have a common definition of the problem, you would consider you have resolved 60% of the problem. And then you develop a commitment to negotiate, and likewise then you arrange the negotiations. And other important aspect of pre-negotiation is that both sides try to lower the intensity of the conflict, which is extremely important for diplomats who are engaging in negotiations. Because when guns are blazing on the border, bullets are flying over your head, it's very difficult for the diplomats and negotiators sitting in the room to come to any sort of agreement. So it's extremely important to lower the intensity of the conflict by bringing about ceasefire, which has occurred, thankfully, between India and Pakistan now. So having said that, let me come on to the Indus Waters Treaty first. The Indus Waters Treaty was considered ripe, in my opinion, for settlement when negotiations started. Both sides wanted to settle the problem, and we had Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the Indian Prime Minister at the time, and he personified a strong leadership. And towards the critical stages of the negotiation, we had General Ayub Khan, who came to power in Pakistan. And within 2 years of his coming to power, the dispute was settled. So we saw a strong political leadership prevailing on both sides, which played a very important role in settling the conflict. Being a technical dispute, because it involved creation of dams, diverting rivers, principal negotiators from both sides were engineers, administrators, lawyers who were well aware of the technicalities of the dispute as well as legalities. Mr. N.D. Gulati was India's chief negotiator. He said in his book, The Indus Waters Treaty, that there was no mass audience to address, no occasion for rhetoric, no inflammatory debating tactics were used, and the two sides adopted a functional and highly professional approach. In many of the negotiations these days, you will see both sides are jumping to the media with all sorts of statements, which does vitiate the atmosphere. The negotiators had full backing of their leaders, and they were encouraged to take tough decisions and strong decisions when they were negotiating. The venue of the negotiation was extremely important. In the critical stages of the negotiations, both sides negotiated in Rome, London, and Washington, away from New Delhi and Karachi. And it did help the negotiators focus on their work, remain insulated from domestic pressures, from media pressures, and media scrutiny, and which does help in easing out pressures, which is always there on the diplomats. And the most important aspect was that both sides, while negotiating, had delinked the Kashmir issue. And they had said that this settlement will set no precedent for Kashmir whatsoever. And lastly, the way the agreement was signed and envisaged, it was very comprehensive in nature. And for instance, there's Article 13.3, which provides for modification of the treaty if the need arises. Many people are talking about Indus Waters Treaty too, and this article provides for that kind of a modification. And there's also a provision for dispute settlement enshrined in the treaty, which talks about the comprehensiveness, the foresight of the negotiators when they finalized this agreement. Let me come on to the second dispute, Ran of Kutch, which was, as I mentioned, involved an area of 3,000 square kilometers, of which finally 300 square miles was given to Pakistan. First, we had the ceasefire because the war had broken between India and Pakistan, and India and Pakistan had to reach a ceasefire in 1965. And finally, as per the ceasefire agreement, it was said that if the two parties are not able to resolve it bilaterally, then we will take it to international arbitration. And it did went to arbitration, and in 1968, arbitration committee comprised of 3 people. Alex Bebler was India's nominee. Mr. Nasrullah Intizam was Pakistan's nominee from Iran, and there was no agreement over who would be the chair. So UN Secretary General U Thant, he nominated Gunnar Lagergren from Sweden as the chair. Many critics in India look at this negotiation as a very unpleasant experience on part of India, because India had lost 300 square miles in the end. It's true. India was weak at the time. We had just lost Pandit Nehru. We had the war. And that's why India succumbed to the pressures to accept a third-party mediation. But it would be a shame if you cannot draw any positive lessons from these negotiations. And to me, the positive lesson from this was the strong leadership of Lal Bahadur Shastri, who unfortunately could not be the prime minister for very long. He showed the political will when the ceasefire agreement was signed. There was a lot of criticism in the parliament, but he said the ceasefire agreement had been reached in the spirit of the talks which were held in 1959 and 1960 under Jawaharlal Nehru, and we should abide by it. We have made an international commitment, and we should abide by it. The other lesson from the negotiation was that even while negotiations were continuing, Pakistan was pushing its troops, not only in the Kutch area, but also in Kashmir, which did intensify the entire conflict, made it very hard for the negotiators to come to any sort of settlement. So which showed that amidst talk, when conflict does occur, it becomes very hard for negotiators to come to any sort of settlement. And we have seen that in Kargil, when the coup occurred in Pakistan in 1999, and we all have seen what happened in Agra when the situation is tense, and when the 2008 Mumbai attack occurred. These are all instances of hostility when it is around, how it becomes very difficult for both sides to talk. So there was strong commitment shown by the Indian leadership, not only by Lal Bahadur Shastri, but later on when Indira Gandhi came to power, and the arbitration announced its decision, there was a hue and cry in the parliament. But Mrs. Indira Gandhi said that India has made an international commitment. We had agreed to go to the arbitration. Arbitration has given its judgment. Come what may, we will implement it, which showed the strength of leadership, which is extremely important in resolving such tricky and tenuous disputes. And both sides, it was also a technical dispute. Both sides had thoroughly discussed before coming to this kind of an agreement. There were 700 documents, more than 400 maps which were used by both sides, 15,000 pages of documents which were put forward. So it was a thoroughly discussed dispute, which showed that it is important beforehand to discuss in such great details and then arrive at an agreement. Once you reach an agreement, you should not backtrack. It will shade the entire atmosphere and leads to a trust deficit. Thank you. Siachen Glacier dispute, as I said, is regarded as the third pole. And before I talk about this, I want to quote from Harold Saunders' book, The Other Walls, in which he quotes President Anwar Sadat when he went to Israel and gave that historic speech. President Anwar Sadat said, "Yet there remains another wall. This wall constitutes a psychological barrier between us, a barrier of suspicion, a barrier of rejection, a barrier of fear, of deception, a barrier of hallucination without any action, deed, or decision, a barrier, distorted and eroded interpretation of every event and statement. It is this psychological barrier which I described in official statements as constituting 70% of the whole problem." And this so aptly describes India-Pakistan dialectic rivalry. When it comes to Siachen, there's no other dispute than Siachen which personifies the mutual distrust which is there between the two states for over 6 decades. But the continuation of the dispute in Siachen to me, shows that it is first important to reach consensus among ourselves in New Delhi. You'll see that on Siachen, opinions is widely divided in New Delhi. There are differences between retired and serving military officials, between strategists, between academicians, between policymakers. So first of all, if you want to resolve Siachen, you have to come to a consensus among yourselves. If you cannot convince your own people how it can be settled, how can you convince the other? Second, as it happened in the Indus Waters Treaty in the Rann of Kutch, India-Pakistan need to delink it from the Kashmir dispute. If you cannot do that, it will be very difficult. Jammu Kashmir can be settled in isolation without looking at Siachen. On the Sir Creek dispute in the Kutch area, again, we see ripeness prevailing on both sides. They want to resolve the dispute. And it shows that both sides consider it as a mutually hurting stalemate. They both say that if we don't resolve it, we'll be worse off. And the conflict has transformed in a way that both sides see economic dividends accruing out of the settlement of these disputes. Even the Indian Prime Minister has said that there's prospect of hydrocarbons in the region, in the sea. And once the territory on the land is settled, it will determine the EEZs of both sides, exclusive economic zones, and which will leave them to explore possibilities of hydrocarbons in the region. So this economic dividend has allowed both sides to come together, discuss and see if they can settle. Both sides have done the joint survey they did in 2005, 2007, and they have shown a resolve to settle this problem. This shows that if both sides come to an agreement that we need to settle it, disputes can be settled. And lastly, on the Tulbul-Buller barrage and Tulbul navigation project and Buller barrage in Jammu and Kashmir dispute, as I said, the name itself tells you how both sides perceive this problem. But the positive that comes out of it is that both sides have been supportive of settling this conflict right from the very beginning, even from General Zia's days. General Zia had also said we should settle it bilaterally. When Mr. Nawaz Sharif was the Chief Minister of Punjab, he had suggested we should take the dispute to arbitration, which was rejected by Ghulam Ishaq Khan and also later by Benazir Bhutto. And later on, Pakistan also realized in the case of the Bagaliya dispute that going to arbitration is expensive, time-consuming, and you do not have the assurance that you will win. So sense has prevailed on both sides, and both sides have shown resolve that we should settle it bilaterally. So these kinds of positive gestures shown by the leadership, it does help in wrapping the issue for settlement. And this is what is required when you're dealing with tricky issues like these. So in the end, I would say that when you're negotiating and you're trying to settle disputes, ripeness of the dispute is extremely important, not only ripeness for negotiations, but also ripeness for settling the agreement. And second, pre-negotiations is extremely important, especially when it is required to lower the intensity of the conflict. I'm glad that since 2003, the ceasefire is in place, not only along the line of control, but also in international border and actual ground position line as it is defined in Siachen region, which does help in lowering the intensity of the conflict. And the strength and commitment of the leadership will be required to settle. And I think we have a very able Prime Minister at the moment, and this can be done. I have looked at India-Pakistan direct rivalry up close for over 20 years when I used to live in Delhi. Now I watch it from a distance, thank God. But on a serious note, let me say this. Today, when the relations are deadlocked, India-Pakistan are finding it very frustrating to settle the disputes. They don't have to throw their hands in the air in despair. They simply have to look at their own history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Misra. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are eating slightly into our morning tea break, but I think in view of the issues that have been raised, I would be quite happy to take one or two quick questions. There's one right in the very front. Could you keep it quick, and I'll ask the panellists to keep their responses quick as well. Is there a microphone for the gentleman right in the front? Thank you very much, sir.
Good morning.
Good
I
morning.
am Dr. Subhakant Behra, New Consul General of India here. My question is really for Professor Suranjan Das, of course directed to Mr. Rajsekhar also. Thank you, Mr. Das, for letting us know with an optimistic tone the possibility of developing what you call India-Pakistan economic bilateralism. But in any contemporary discourse or any narrative on bilateral economic relations within the South Asian context, SAARC, particularly SAPTA, has to be factored in. So my precise question to you and to Professor Rajsekhar, how you foresee the role of SAPTA in fostering what you people have termed as economic bilateralism? Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Das.
Yep. Can I take other questions together, or?
Oh, I think we should do them one at a time. I might have time for two.
Would you like to respond first? Hey, okay.
About SAARC.
Shall I sit
Just
here?
stay where
Oh,
you are. Yeah, there you go.
okay.
Of course, in the light of the present Pakistan declaration that they are going to be
MFN, yeah. Well, that's a very positive sign that we have. And India had accorded most favored nation status to Pakistan long time back. And now Pakistan has also agreed to do the same. It is true that the full potentials of SAFTA 1 and SAFTA 2 have not been realized in practice. And therefore, I have suggested that one way of ensuring the realization of the full potentials is to divide the trading commodities into three parts. And we can then proceed on a differential timescale to make Pakistan understand that the opening up of trade to India would not necessarily lead to what they fear, the establishment of Indian hegemony over the domestic market. So that was one argument that I made, and that is also an argument which is being made by a large number of Indian and Pakistani scholars that has not been tried. If we try, perhaps SAFTA will be able to realize its full potentials.
Thank you. Rajesh?
I think trade, the benefits of trade, I'm not that very certain about. I mean, for example, India-China trade has gone up hugely, but
Yes.
so have the disputes. I mean, so India or China, the same thing with the United States or with Japan. So the assumption, automatic assumption that somehow increased intra-regional trade is going to lead to peace is somewhat of a, I'm somewhat of a skeptic on that. But now that is not the sole reason, obviously. I think there are larger benefits that come out of trade also. But you have to also, I think we have to also, one of the things I think that despite the Gujarat doctrine that we have not been sensitive about is the insecurity that our neighbors feel on all of these issues, on whether it's trade or culture or any of these issues. And we really have to proceed a little bit more at their pace rather than, and which is what has been the case, rather than at the pace that we want to, because every time we insist that they do, that they open up their market or any of those things, their insecurity tends to increase. So I think we need to be a little bit more careful about how insecure they, or at least understand that their insecurity vis-a-vis dealing with a much larger country. I think even at the intellectual level, if we understand that they are insecure, sometimes we don't sort of translate that into our policy. I think that insecurity is something that we have to give greater credence to.
I have two questions and we've only got about 2 minutes. Can I take this one very quickly?
Thanks. Ramesh Thakur, ANU. In telegraphic form, 3 question marks for the whole region. 1, for the first time, we have a strongly pro-India leadership in Bangladesh, but because of internal difficulties between the central government and the state government, problems occur at the very last moment. What does this say about the ability of the Indian political system to deliver on some positive outcomes? 2, the role of the United States, everyone picked up, is very important, but I think the Americans need to switch completely to thinking of India as the solution, not a problem, and thinking of the military in Pakistan as a problem, not a solution. And I haven't seen signs of that, particularly the last one. 3rd, in Sri Lanka, the government seems to be bent on losing the opportunity after military triumph of acting with generosity and in a magnanimous spirit towards the Tamils, and instead retreating into triumphalism. This poses significant long-term problems for India in managing the region, in managing domestic politics vis-a-vis Tamils, and in managing relations, given the Sri Lankan diaspora, given the Tamil diaspora, managing relations with other key countries, including Britain, Canada, and Australia.
Any comment from the panel? Rajesh?
I think on Bangladesh, I am again somewhat skeptical because I keep using that word. But the point is that basically that, if the next election, it could be, it's the improvement in relations has primarily got to do with the change in political, in the politics of Bangladesh, or rather the change of the government in Bangladesh. So if the next election, the BNP were to come back to power, I'm not sure that this momentum will necessarily be sustained. But having said that, I think partly, obviously, we have a problem also, especially as we have had coalition governments for the last 20 years, and we are likely to only have coalition governments for the next 20 years. How do we take into consideration regional political parties and their, and their sort of interests, whether it's Bangladesh or Tamil Nadu or Punjab, West Bengal or Tamil Nadu or Punjab, and the impact that has on foreign policy. So clearly, Indian central governments are going to have to pay greater attention to regional political parties and what that might have, how that might impact on foreign policy is going to be an issue. Sri Lanka, I fully agree with you. I mean, I think they are losing the peace. I mean, but there is only so much that anybody from the outside can do about it. If they're intent on losing the peace, what can anybody else do about it?
Thank you.
If
Misra, yes?
Yeah, if I can quickly add to it, Professor Thakur, is that has always been a challenge when it comes to Bangladesh, that when Begum Khaleda Zia has been in power, India has been struggling to make breakthroughs. And when Sheikh Hasina has been in power, we have been negotiating the Ganges dispute for so long, but finally the moment Awami League came to power, we were able to settle it. And when Khaleda Zia comes, it's a totally different ballgame. So that is the problem that India faces Bangladesh. Fortunately, on the Western front, when it comes to Pakistan, recently the Pakistani Foreign Minister Hina Rabbani Khar came, and she said something very important. She said that all political parties in Pakistan support the peace process with India. Now that kind of general perception for peace with India has not yet germinated in Pakistan, especially with BNP. And unless that happens, I think India will have to sort of deal with the new regime as and when it comes in Bangladesh.
Thank you. The last question there.
Hello, I am S.K. Jain from University of Delhi. I would like to just say that in the context of the changing domestic politics, in the era of coalition and federal politics of India, how do you look at India's foreign policy in terms of federalization of foreign policy? Do you support the federalization of foreign policy? If you support, how would you reconcile the national interests with the regional interests, particularly the bordering states of India? Would you like to comment to all the panels?
The panelists on federalization of foreign policy.
Yeah, I don't think it's a question of whether you like it or not. I mean, it's a fact. I mean,
Right.
If we are going to have coalition governments and if you're going to have regional parties from those states involved in the government, I mean, you're going to have to take into consideration their views. It's no longer a unitary, a single party governing in Delhi and dictating whatever or proceeding on foreign policy the way it likes. So even if it were not that case, for example, in the case of Tamil Nadu and the impact that it has on India's policy towards Sri Lanka, there is going to be an impact, even if the government is not, even if that local political party is not part of the coalition. But fortunately or unfortunately, the fact is that we are going to have coalition governments. I mean, so that is going to be, whether we like it or not, that's going to make our foreign policy much more complicated. But that's a reality. I mean, we have to just deal with it.
And if I could quickly say that I'm still not convinced that foreign policy plays a very important role in Indian politics. The regimes are determined in New Delhi not on the basis of what kind of foreign policy they have had. They are purely determined on the basis how they have handled domestic issues. And apart from Kashmir, I don't think there's any other very important foreign policy issue which would determine the shape of domestic politics in India. These are purely determined on the basis of domestic issues like corruption, employment, and public goods that government could deliver. These are the issues which determine the tenor and shade of your domestic politics.
Professor Das, last word.
Yes, well, I do think that increasingly foreign policy is becoming an important ingredient in domestic politics. For example, see, everything was settled that Tista Treaty would be signed. The West Bengal government said no, the treaty couldn't be signed. And they were very strong domestic compulsions on the part of the West Bengal government not to go ahead with it. Second, the very important point of the federalization of Indian foreign policy. I think it is only recent years that New Delhi has realized that India does not speak in same voice even when it comes to foreign policy. Earlier, there was a feeling that in terms of foreign policy, there was some sort of a homogenization of view. But now the Indian government has realized that what Bombay, Madras, Delhi feels, Calcutta might not feel the same way. And it is whereas in that context that the Public Policy Division of the Ministry of External Affairs has decided to establish think tanks and research institutes in various parts of the country outside Delhi. Dr. Behra is here. It was largely because of his initiative and the Minister of External Affairs initiative and largely due to Honorable Mr. Pranab Mukherjee's initiative. We have in Calcutta University an Institute of Foreign Policy Studies funded by the MEA. And we initiated a study of how to enhance the realization of the potentials of the SAFTA that Dr. Behra mentioned. And we identified that if we can divide the tradable commodities into three parts, the competing, non-competing, and excluded categories. And then if we proceed on normalization of the trade on a different time scale on these three categories, there are possibilities of fullest realization of the SAFTA. Now, this again shows how if the federalization of Indian foreign policy takes place, it would be beneficial not only to Delhi, but to the entire country and to the entire region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close there. I realise there's a lot of interest in this session, which is terrific. Please do take the opportunity to speak to the speakers here over morning tea. And would you join with me now in thanking them all, Professor Das, Rajagopalan and Dr. Misra. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thanks to the chair.
No,
Thank you very much.